I think it's much more pleasing for a brain for a viewer or whatever to um, have to have a little bit of input in order to complete your picture. I don't think somebody is going to want to have to look at your artwork and work at figuring out what's going on, but leaving it just a little bit incomplete can make it a lot more visually interesting. So now what I'm doing here, this is a woman's hand, and I'm going to go into a bunch of drawings of women's hands. And obviously, anatomically, women's hands are exactly the same as men's, except for the fact that they're more narrow and sleek and long. Stereotypically, obviously, I mean there are variations for everything, but for the purposes of learning the differences between men's and women's hands, I always draw the fingers much in a much more pointed way, like a slender, pointed way, and that's really an illusion created just by fingernails. But it's an effective way of drawing them. I would never draw a man's finger quite as pointed as I'm drawing these fingers here. Uh, there's a muscle that the meat of the thumb muscle. A lot of times I would draw in that drawing, but being a woman's hand, it's not as pronounced. So I'm really not drawing it in. I really try and stay away from like I would certainly never draw veins on the back of a woman's hand. It's really not as attractive unless I was trying to draw an old woman or something like that. And so for these, you can see I'm breaking down my hand, and I've got the line for my knuckles and that box form for the back of the hand. Um, Fairly simple, just enough to give me enough of an idea of where I'm placing my fingers. For the most part, all these hands I'm just drawing from memory. And that's just a result of having drawn hands for years and years and years. Eventually, they all become part of a visual vocabulary that you build for yourself. And that's just natural. And I think actually it's important for me to really point out that the only way you will develop a broad visual vocabulary is to constantly draw, but also constantly draw upon new sources of reference. And I always recommend this actually with figure drawing too, and that is with any kind of drawing, the most important aspect of the drawing is always the foundation underneath. All the finish and the shadow and the rendering and anything else that you put onto it is like icing on a cake. So I find the easiest way to learn how to get dynamic with your bodies and also dynamic with your hands is to look at life, look at other artists, look at your own body, whatever works for you. I would certainly recommend, honestly, to look at other artists because other artists are breaking down visual problems for you. You know, life doesn't actually break down that problem, and you can learn a great deal from how other artists have solved those problems. And to ignore that vast resource of information, I think is just foolish. Frankly, I hear all the time, I read all the time about artists talking about how they learned how to draw from life, and I think that's wonderful. But I can plainly see the influences in their work. And for them to deny those influences seems to me is it's a little disingenuous. I think that there's nothing wrong with having influences on your artwork, and you should embrace them and learn as much from those artists as you possibly can. They all have a lot to teach. So here I'm going into line weights just a little bit, and using them to separate the fingers from each other. You can see I just at the tip of that finger, I drew the fingernail just a little bit. I didn't actually draw the whole nail, but the shape of it as it extends from the finger. And with this hand, it's just a flattened hand, but you can do this with your own hand. The fingers are just fully extended, and it gives it a bit of a dynamic sweep. Here's a woman's hand just at rest. And I'm erasing it actually, I think, because it's just a little bit beefy in there. I've just thinned it out just a little bit. I pointed the thumb quite a bit more and made it a little softer. Um, I think I've had the problem in the past of making my women's hands maybe a little bigger and more, manly than they could be. I certainly have had that problem with women's feet. It's just so easy what you draw constantly, what you feel more comfortable with that you fall back upon if you're not thinking. It's always embarrassing when I see a published drawing of mine and it's got those kind of problems, and obviously because it's published, it's hard to really erase it and fix it. I find women's hands a lot of times can be capable of uh, dynamics that men's hands might not really describe quite as well. I think I'm pretty happy with that hand actually. It looks like it could belong to like a magician of some kind, maybe casting a spell or something like that. So it has a certain dynamic to it. And for some of these hands, I'm actually really making this up as I go along. I should point out. So a lot of these hands are hands that I use very commonly, and that I fall back on. So it's pretty easy for me to. I wouldn't say I don't have a hand number two and hand number three that I don't have it broken down to that extent, but I've got certain sorts of hands that I draw often enough that it's pretty easy just to sit here and go draw one after the other. But also, I'm using my own hand here and there just to give me some ideas, and obviously that can be very helpful. Now, generally, with all these hands, I think you can see that they have a very different look than the man's hands, and yet the gestures could be the same. I'm using different gestures for a lot of these hands than I would for a men's hand, and that goes a long way towards describing anything that you're drawing. I think if you if you draw the Incredible Hulk sitting in an armchair, you know, uh, drinking some wine, he won't have the feel that you want from the Hulk. He needs to be smashing the ground and screaming and scowling his eyes, and in a way that's almost more important, I think, is more important than the way that you actually draw the character. It's the gesture and the pose and the body language that a character has. It goes further than the actual physical appearance, and it's the same with hands. With my women's hands, the gesture shows you that it's a woman just as much as the actual way that I'm approaching the drawing. I, I want to point out with these drawings, I'm tending to not really with this hand. I'm doing it. I'm going in and doing a bit of an underdrawing so I can be a little bit more comfortable, because it's a hand that's a little bit more difficult for me to draw. But hands that I'm most comfortable drawing, I'll usually just start throwing it in, and that's partly because there's really only so much time on this DVD, and I don't want to spend too much time constructing all the basic forms down to every little detail on every hand, because there's really only so much you can get out of seeing the same thing over and over. But also because just for myself, the more I learn how to do something, the longer I've been doing this, I've gotten to the point where I can kind of see the underdrawing in my head. I know where it is, and I can kind of complete it in my head. I can see it on the page, so I'm drawing. I'm drawing in a way what I can already see, and I'm sure that for you watching this, I'm sure you understand what I mean. I mean, to compare it to writing, it would be similar to saying that if I'm going to write the letter B, I can see the letter B on the page. I can visualize it on the page, and that's really all it is. And so right now, I'm actually looking at my right hand and drawing my right hand, and there's a certain degree of editing that needs to happen there, because obviously I don't have a woman's hand, but it's fairly easy for me to look at my own hand and then just make it a little longer and sleeker. And that's something you should really be aware of if you're using your own hand as reference. You don't need uh, a female model necessarily to give you a female hand. You just need to know the things that go into making a hand look female, and make sure to keep those things in mind. And I think you can see that this drawing is really proportionally nothing like the hand that I have sitting there holding my eraser. And I'm actually uh, thinning it there more than my underdrawing. Just correcting, I think, for the fact that I was using my own hand as reference, so it needed just a little bit of softening. Now you notice with this hand here, this is being pointed away, how the thumb has a bit of a spade-like look to it, and directly on, if you're looking directly at your thumb, it has that look. And I think I've maybe over accentuated that just a little bit, but considering that it's being pushed out into perspective, it's foreshortened a bit. I find for me that over accentuating a form that's being pushed into perspective can be very effective for me. I think it's a technique that's pretty common with a lot of artists. I know, I'm sure that a lot of you are familiar with John Buscema's work. He's an artist that worked for Marvel for years and years and years, and he's got a lot of artists that are heavily influenced by his work, including actually my former boss, Mark Silvestri, and me. And when he would draw legs, his lower leg, the calf part of his leg, would always be very, very turned. He would never draw it as a straight line. It always had a real curve to it that was heavily over accentuated, more curved than any human would really ever actually have. But it worked. It looked right, and it visually it was very, very effective, because that curve just gave a lot of depth to his foreshortening. You can see there, I'm drawing again the wrist attaching to the hand, and I'm drawing maybe a bit of a wire mesh on top of it just to try and make that absolutely clear. But I think I'm doing that because from certain angles it can be very difficult to bear that kind of thing in mind. From a direct sidelong view of the hand, it can be easy to keep in mind to raise the wrist from it, but from that angle, it might be just a little bit more difficult. So hopefully that helps. Now with this hand that I'm drawing, you can see that I haven't done any underdrawing at all. So we'll see how this works for me. I'm really just kind of breaking right into it. Now I'm actually doing a little bit of underdrawing as I go with the thumb to try and make that work properly. And I think you can see that I'm running into trouble now as a result. I'm having to proportionally fix things. Um, but I think it's looking actually pretty good right now. I find for me, sidelong, looking at the fingers curled under the hand, it can be a very difficult thing for me to draw. It's something I really struggle with. Um, and making them all line up in perspective like that can be tough. Fortunately, though, that's probably the easiest angle to verify with your own hand. And I would really recommend that as you try some of these hands and experiment with them, uh, that you make absolutely sure to not shortcut at all and draw the underdrawing underneath all of them completely before you actually go into the drawing. I think especially, well, certainly as you're learning, it's very, very important to do uh, to go through all the steps and not skip anything. Um, I know for me, actually, the fact that I skip some of those steps, um, it's actually really caused me to lose things that I once had. There are areas of anatomy that I know I kind of struggle with a little bit that I used to feel a little more confident with. And that's just a result of me not blocking in those forms every single time, maybe the way that I should.